introduce ourselves. I'm Jake Boritt, of course. I'm the festival director and a graduate of this high school. And we're just going to have a short conversation about some of the historical merits and what went on with this particular moment in World War II history and the particular moment in the 1970s and really an early piece of Martin Sheen's career, but clearly one that's still a major part of his. So,
yeah, and I'm Kris White. I'm the Director of Education and Events at the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm honored to be up here with Jared and with Jake here to talk about this film.
My name is Jared Frederick. I am a history professor at Penn State Altoona.
You're not on.
it's Jared Frederick.
There we go. My name is Jared Frederick. I'm a history professor at Penn State Altoona and a host of Real History.
And so, Jared, I know you've done a lot with historical filmmaking across many genres and historical periods. What is the significance when this comes out in about 1974? What is the significance of that period as far as a film on the U.S. military?
What I always tell my students is that when we analyze historical films, those movies often tell us as much about the time period in which they were made as much as the time period that they depict. And it's important for us to keep in mind this is a TV movie. It aired on NBC in March of 1974, almost a year immediately prior to the end of hostilities in Vietnam. And so, as is the case with a lot of films of this genre in the 1970s, the specter of Vietnam hovers over it from that sort of cultural context. And when we look at Martin's filmography of that decade, not only do we have this film, not only is the decade bookended by the masterpiece of Apocalypse Now, but he also was in another Civil War, two Civil War movies, in fact, before he played Robert E. Lee in Gettysburg. He played a young lieutenant in the Andersonville Trial, which was another TV movie directed by none other than George C. Scott of Patton fame. And he was also in an anti-war film from the 1970s where he played a conscientious objector to the American Civil War entitled No Drums, No Bugles. And so we find this to be a running thread throughout his career in the 1970s, that very stark anti-war statement that has us think a little bit more about humanity and our relationship with it.
And Kris, I know you spent a lot of time talking to Martin about his work, and this film included, and there's some pretty poignant stories about why he did this and really how it affected the trajectory of his life and his, not just his acting, but clearly his activism. And why is that? I mean, how did this spark Martin and clearly Joe Cosgrove?
Yeah, this really spoke to Martin, and he told us some stories over the last few years about making this film as well as some others. And one of the stories and one of the key themes for him was the human rights struggle and the struggle against capital punishment. And that's one of the reasons he wanted to make this film. He thought that the capital punishment end of things with Eddie Slovik was a very poignant story to tell. He also had a story that is actually tied into his time on the West Wing. I mean, Joe, who was just up here, he's basis for some of the characters that are on the West Wing and help with some of the stories, including one about President Bartlett struggling with capital punishment and going against the Supreme Court, should he exonerate someone or not. But he told us a story last year as we were sitting at dinner, and it was very heart-wrenching. The movie Gods and Generals, he couldn't make that movie because he was obligated to go to the West Wing to shoot the West Wing. But he constantly would fly between LA and Washington to film the West Wing because they would do some of it on the soundstage and then come here to Washington. And he got to know the air crew very well because Martin doesn't know a stranger. He knows everybody. He's going to walk behind here. He's going to shake everyone's hands and get to know you. And he got to know the pilot of this jetliner. And he said, you made this film in the 1970s. I can't find it anywhere. And it's The Execution of Private Eddie Slovik. And Martin said, I can get you a copy of that. And he goes out and he makes a VHS. Yes, VHSs existed at that time. And brings it to this pilot and said, please enjoy this. And a few weeks later, he was watching the news. And it was September 11th of 2001. And that pilot was one of the pilots of one of the aircrafts that were hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. and it moved him deeply that this man who he knew, who wanted to watch his film work, especially this film, it resonates with him, and that's a story that he tells not too often. I've only heard him tell it maybe 2 times, but it's a sad story, but he always ties that to this movie as well.
Yeah, no, I remember we shared that with Jeff Shera. We were talking about Gods and Generals last year, and he said exactly that.
It has saved his life. He said that he did not book it.
Saved his life, that he didn't do the movie. Yeah. So, Jared, I mean, you know a fair amount about the history around the World War II era and that particular moment. And so the construct of it, how unique is this? And I mean, Martin referenced it a little bit, but it really is kind of an anomaly in American history, this story, right?
For sure, and I think something that is worth prefacing, I encourage all of us to look at the World War II generation not merely as the greatest generation, but in many ways they're a lot like us. There are a lot of untrustworthy and shady characters who were around back in the 1940s, as is the case today as well. And in fact, a third of the criminal activity conducted in the United States between 1941 and 1945 was done by men who were in uniform in service to their country. So that's a statistic that some people are often surprised by.
Tom Brokaw didn't speak about that one too much.
He surely did not. But in any case, as Martin recollected just a moment ago, Eddie Slovik had some problems with criminality. He had been a juvenile delinquent of sorts. He had run-ins with the law. And in fact, when the war began, he was designated 4F. He was deemed unfit for military service. But as the war progressed and as men and especially replacements were needed, he was suddenly deemed A1 to go ultimately back into service. And so he does stateside training. He actually trains for a short spell not too far away from here at Fort Meade in Maryland. But he eventually ends up in the ranks of the 109th Regiment in the 28th Infantry Division. And this is a division that would become known as the Bloody Bucket, and that would be a nickname that is very well earned. I'll give a shout out to my brother in the audience as well, who just happens to be education director at the Pennsylvania Military Museum near State College. And that is the home of the 28th Infantry Division Shrine, and that is a worthwhile military landmark to check out here in Pennsylvania if you've never had the opportunity. But at this point in the war, like so many other divisions, the 28th was in dire need of replacements. And the method as to how replacements were being received on the front lines, it was very much the idea of quantity over quality. These men were getting basic training in a very, very limited and loose sense. They were thrown into these replacement depots when they arrived overseas. And I think it's safe to assume that a lot of them lacked the sort of camaraderie that some of their earlier predecessors might have had. And so that perhaps the lack of a buddy system we could consider to be a contributing factor as to why he ultimately decides to go astray.
Yeah, and I would add on, to put it into context, if you have your program that is beautifully printed, one of the final pictures in it is the 28th Division marching down the Champs-Élysées on August 25th of 1944 as Paris is being liberated. They're going to march out of Paris and head up into Northwest Europe and enter what is the hell of the Hurtgen Forest. Slovik knows that this is going to happen, and he's a petty criminal in Detroit as he's growing up, doesn't want to be in the Army, and decides, as the division is starting to move to the front, and he is being placed within his regiment in the 28th, that he doesn't want to fight, and he deserts for about 6 weeks. And in fact, he's in fact picked up by the Canadians, who eventually turn him over to the Americans, and he writes this letter. It's a very damning letter, saying that I'm not going to fight. I'm going to always sit this out. I'm shaking. I'm scared. I don't want to be part of this battle. And it goes to Norman Coda. And if you ever watch The Longest Day, he's played by Robert Mitchum very well. Dutch Coda is a West Point graduate of the class of 1917. And when this comes across his desk and seeing what's happening to his division now, he was the deputy commander of the 29th on D-Day, moves up to be the commander of the 28th for the Hurtgen. He says, I can't let this pass. And they ask him, Slovik, a few times, will you rip up this letter? Will you put it off to the side? Will you fight? And he refuses to time and time again. So he's making this statement, much like the political statement of this movie. And finally, Coda says, I can't let this pass. I can't look these men in the eye if I went up onto the front lines and seeing what's going on in the hell of the Hurtgen. Literal tree bursts going off. These men are in a meat grinder. He decides that he is going to give him the death penalty. And he goes through the chains of command, and finally it's actually passed on January 31st of 1945 when he is executed in the Colmar region of France, and then buried in a cemetery, the WWII cemetery, which is near Reims over in France, but in a section that is away from all of the other honorable soldiers who died, and he is buried originally with many of the rapists, the thieves, and others who had been hanged for other crimes throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe. His body's taken back to the United States, but it's a tragic tale, and he's surprised that he's going to be he's killed. And I'll use an example quickly and kick it back to these two of one of the famous Band of Brothers. David Kenyon Webster leaves us a fantastic memoir. It's called Parachute Infantry. And towards the end of the book, after Band of Brothers ends, he's still in Company E, and he is still with the company when they transfer back to France. And he talks about being near a military prison, and he sees deserters. And one of his comments was, they got 20 to 25 years hard labor, but nobody ever actually serves more than 3 to 5 years. So when Slovik is killed, this is really against the norm, even though it is the only one. Even the soldiers who were on the front lines knew it's not a life sentence like people would say, or that 25 years of life that they would give to him. So it's an interesting story within that context. You have a commander who's very decorated, whose hand is pushed, is played there, and then you're dealing with the Hurtgen, you're dealing with this evolving war, and one soldier who doesn't want to be there, and he thinks he found his way out.
I'll add 2 quick points onto that, and I think it's worthy to reflect upon the hell that was the Hurtgen Forest and how the 28th, amongst so many other divisions, endured that. That was the longest battle in U.S. Army history, and it was a true meat grinder. One division would go in, they would get spit out, and it was just a perpetual conveyor belt of death. I think it's a good way to put it. And part of me cannot blame Eddie Slovik for not wanting to go into that. But all that said, it does not endear him to any of his comrades who did go through it and say, why weren't you there with us? And comparable to the Battle of the Bulge as well. The other point that I think is worth reflecting upon is the concepts of military justice at the time. As you alluded to, there are a few dozen GIs who are executed in Europe, and a lot of them are for rape, murder, very serious capital crimes. And much like the Civil War, though, many of those who were executed were disproportionately African American or minorities as well. So that should be taken into account into the judicial mindset of the 1940s military as well. But amidst all of that, Private Slovik stands out.
And Jared, you have an amazing artifact that's sitting up on the stage. We have a little show and tell here. You might not be able to see it from afar, but Jared pulled this out earlier today, and I was just amazed.
And what I will do, if you can't see it well up on the screen, or you would like to see it up close and personal, I will stick around here after the show at the front of the stage and show you up close and personal. But I'll say this too, in addition to the 12 unfortunate GIs, comrades in the 28th Division who were tasked with pulling the trigger of their M1 Grand rifles, 11 of the 12 were issued 1 round of live ammunition. And then the 12th man received a blank round. And that was all to offer a degree of emotional and psychological comfort where one of the men, or all of the men, could have a little bit of security thinking, well, maybe I'm shooting the blank round. Maybe I won't be killing this guy. I don't think it's a spoiler alert giving the title of the movie, but when the inevitable finally comes, every single man hits his target. All 11 rounds hit that of Private Slovik. As if that wasn't grim enough, though, The 28th Division brought in men from all of the regiments within the division to witness the execution as well. And the thought here was this needs to be done so they can go back to the rank and file and they can share what they have seen with their fellow buddies to serve as a warning. And this, of course, is the principal reason why he is being executed. Nobody else is. An example needs to be set to curtail these increasing desertion rates. And among the men who was a witness there that day was a private from New Jersey whose name was Joseph Vitorisi. And I just happened to have his dog tags here with me. And so these dog tags were present at the execution of Private Slovik. And Vitorisi's name is also listed in the back of the book upon which this movie is based. And so it's a very grim artifact, but it tells a very powerful story. And I think the power of that story is so eloquently conveyed by Martin Sheen.
So you just have a couple minutes left before we're going to run the film. And I mean, what's the legacy both of the execution and then of Martin's performance and the film? I mean, to both of you, what do we take from this at the time and then later on?
From an artistic standpoint, and I'll let Kris handle the historical end of it, like I said, it fits within a trend where American television viewers are starting to grow different conceptions of what war is. If we think back to the sorts of depiction of World War II that were existing just a decade before this, the television shows of combat with Vic Morrow or 12 O'Clock High, which tended to show a very humanistic but rather glorified interpretation of the Second World War. And I also see tonight's film as a predecessor to even bigger and more noteworthy television productions like Roots, which comes out just 3 years later. The success of films like this demonstrate that there is an appetite for historical films with complex storylines and complicated characters. And I think that is really one of the great artistic merits of the film. Indeed, in addition to it being a rather overlooked yet very prominent role for Martin Sheen.
Yeah, and I think you're starting to see that change in the war films as well, going from Tora, Tora, Tora to the Battle of the Bulge and other films like that, which were very much, here's a historical film telling the larger story. This is finally telling the smaller story. And it's also, in the time, showing the change within the U.S. Army. I think Rick Atkinson does a fantastic job showing us the class of 1966 at West Point in the Long Gray Line and showing how they're the real first West Point class to go over to Vietnam, and they were the gung-ho, they were ready to get into the action. And by 1974, things are winding down. The U.S. Army, it's still fighting in Vietnam, but it doesn't have the same impact. People at home are trying to push back in these anti-war ways. They're trying to push back against what they see as atrocities sometimes in Vietnam. And I think that when Martin signed on for this, that is something that he was pushing back against as well. This was not only against capital punishment, but this was, in a way, an anti-war film because Slovik is very much anti-war. He does not want to be there, and he's very clear time and again. He also thinks that he's killed Slovik because of all of his petty crimes, which is just not, it doesn't really play into it in that case. It's the stance that the Army has to take. But I think that's what we're seeing here with this movie changing. And of course, we'll have Pat and we'll have some other great movies that come out within these years. But Slovik is definitely starting to go against the normal grain that we would see. And that's what we're starting to see here in the United States as well with the change in Vietnam.
Well, thank you. I know Martin and Joe are really disappointed not to be able to be with us longer tonight. But I'm honored to have Jared and Kris on the festival stage for the first time, and hopefully not the last. But we're going to play the movie, A Private Slovik, momentarily. So stand by, and we'll get that going. And thank you very much for bearing with us tonight and being part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.